Well, welcome to my talk today. In case you don't recognize me, I'm Benjamin Franklin, and I thought I'd talk a little bit about some coins, paper money, and things involved with numismatics. So I should be polite and stand up and remove my hat indoors. So I titled this talk in sort of an interesting way. Benjamin Franklin, myself, always viewed himself as a printer and he as a tradesman. Even in his life, throughout the latter parts of my life, even as an ambassador negotiating treaties, but he often signed documents or letters, B. Franklin Printer. So I wrote this little spot up here. Then I got to thinking about Benjamin Franklin Numismatist. This is probably an engraving when I was I'm actually printing now, so I was in Philadelphia at this point. I started out as an apprentice to my older brother, James Franklin, in the New England Courant, and that's where I learned the trade. I actually wanted to become a sailor and go out to sea. I was living in Boston as a young boy, and the harbor was full of the beautiful tall ships, and I just loved going down to the harbor side and watching all the activity and commerce that was occurring there. But my parents had a different idea, because my older brother was a sailor that went out to sea and never came back. So my mother certainly did not encourage me to become a sailor. So my father would take me around Boston and show me different trades, the bricklayers, the glass makers, glass blowers, and carpenters, and try to interest me in something else. But I ended up and I was very young at this point. I'm 10 years old, 11 years old. He's just tried to gear me to another direction. So I ended up in the family business. My father's, he was a soap maker and a candle maker, chandler. And he was trained as a silk dyer in England, but when he arrived in Boston, clearly saw there was nobody running around with much silk on there draped around them like there was in London. So he quickly took up the candle trade. And my parents sold other things in the shop, some soaps and different other items, and raised I was one of 17, so there was a large family. But my brother, in his print shop, we decided, and it was mostly my parents, that he should take me on as an apprentice. So I did that at 11 years old or young. And apprenticeships at that time were very long ordeals. It was a binding contract. It was illegal to break that contract. So I learned from my older brother. He was a very tough taskmaster, but I started out doing the simple things, taking his newspapers down, which, by the way, was probably the first free press in America. There was some printing going on in Boston at the time. There was a very Puritan Boston with Cotton and Increase Mather really had the hard grip and with the religion at the time. My father, coming from England, I would describe him more as a Reformed Presbyterian, but we lived in Boston. They certainly lived their whole lives in Boston, and I got to eventually befriend the Mathers, and the younger was more of my age. But my brother James' newspaper, I moved on to becoming a compositor, and that's when I had to get the little lead type pieces out and align them to the sentences, the rows, the spaces, the spacers, and they have to tap them in and put them tight, and then the headlines and all the things involved in printing a single sheet of newsprint. So I learned from really the ground up, and but I was a quick learner, so my frustration set in when my brother and his friends, he always paid attention to them. I was trying to get them to publish the things I was writing at the time, and he wouldn't even hear of it. So I decided to write some things at night and letters to the editor, and I would tie them with a ribbon and slip them under his front door of the print shop early before he arrived. So these letters would occasionally appear, and he would read it, and they were quite clever and engaging by a widowed lady across town named Silence Dogood. So my writing started at a very young age, and these letters that appeared in the Courant became very popular, and so the sales went up. And of course James was delighted, and his friends were trying to guess, who is this Silence Dogood, and with her ideas of life and happiness. So I continued that, I think, probably a couple of months with the secret letters to the editor, and finally I was found out. My brother was none too pleased, and it sort of put a stop to that. So that was part of the groundwork for my departure from Boston. I ended up leaving Boston 16 years old. I broke my apprenticeship, but that came in an odd legal way when my older brother James was jailed for printing things that the Mathers didn't care for, or the Assembly in Boston. So while he had his term in jail, he turned over sort of pseudo ownership of the print shop to Ben Franklin. So in essence, the publisher. Of course, that went to my head a little bit. But so when James got out of jail, some 30, 40 days later, he returns to the print shop and wants to have everything run the same as it always did, and with his strict enforcement rules. So I thought this was a good time to leave. I had a friend of mine that knew a ship captain, and told them that I'm leaving Boston because I've got myself in a little bit of trouble. I impregnated some young girl, and I had to leave rather quickly, even though that was not true. But it was, the captain was sympathetic, and then I was on a miserable sloop heading south, and ended up in New York, and I'm trying to find work in print shops there, and I came upon William Bradstreet, who told me, why don't you go to Philadelphia? My son has a print shop, and he might be able to hire you. So I continued on to Philadelphia as a rag mess of trying to present myself as not a runaway. And I finally got employment by Samuel Keimer, who was a printer in Philadelphia at the time. So a lot of my training was in Keimer's print shop. But I ended up, the governor of Pennsylvania was quite impressed with my skills and my expertise in writing. He decided to fund me to go to London. He said, Philadelphia needs another printer. So he would write a letter of recommendation. In those days, these letters were key to commerce, because you would arrive somewhere, you'd have to have a letter, basically a guarantee, a co-signer, because we had no banks to speak of, so these letters were very important. I arrived in London, and of course there was no letter on the ship, so I was close to penniless in another country, at about 17 years old. So I started looking for work at some of the printing houses in London, and I worked in Watson for a while, Palmer's for a while. I learned a magnificent amount of printing in London. They were the premier printers of the world. I learned copper plate engraving, all sorts of techniques. These things were, I just could not absorb fast enough. And I have to watch myself because I want to get into the rest of my talks about the coin. So Mr. Hall, could you advance that one? There's just an example. When I finally did get my own print shop, I started printing the Pennsylvania Gazette, and this is an original copy, and just to see some of the style and how small the typeset is, and the tedious amount of work it would take to make these issues. Then famously, my poor Richard Saunders and his wife Bridget, I talked a lot about them in my almanac, which was very popular. I made the almanac was so popular, I was able to make quite a bit of money. And my wife Debbie Franklin, she worked in the print shop as well. We sold newspapers, the almanac, stationery, soap that came from my family. It was called Crown soap at that time, very good quality. All sorts of different things. And Debbie was the fantastic manager of our print shop. And she was the one that would hand tie the almanacs. That's a cord there that you just punch the holes in and to keep it bound together. Now, since my skills, I set upon acquiring contracts to print paper money, which started to become popular. There was small change in coin is very difficult in the colonies. There were parts that had very little of it. So I got contracts to print for, and it has my name, B. Franklin, David Hall, and I did some techniques here. It's a two-color image, if you notice. I used for counterfeiting, and I also used the veins in the leaves, the detail of the leaves. I could spot counterfeits fairly easy. That I knew what I engraved, and it was easy to that I would tell people, if you see that a certain thing, look for it. It's like counterfeit coins, I'm told. So there are markers that I had introduced into the currency at the time. This note I actually own, and I think if I remember correctly, it's browned to a curve there. I believe I had that setting at a tavern, and I set my ale on the end of it, but so it still exists. I was very surprised. So another thing I did besides the printing currency had promissory notes, or a note to issue payment. There's my signature, B. Franklin, and it has an X crossing out. That means that note has been satisfied and paid. And I'm looking here, and it says in here, it has a 75. There's an L there for pounds. 75 pounds back in that time was a significant amount of money. I'm wondering what I bought. but yeah, this note was actually sitting in 2019 ANA show in Chicago by this gentleman. It had it framed, so I was very delighted to be reacquainted with it again. I tried to claim ownership, but he was not too interested in giving it away. Now, probably, for a lot of you know, probably one of my most famous connections is with the Libertas Americana medal. And it was a magnificent design. Of course, I'm bragging about myself, but by Augustin Dupre and me. And so I was asked to create this for the Siege of Yorktown after we won the war, we needed to create something. I mean, at this point, I'm still in France, so that's why Dupre did the medal. He was French, and he had the gorgeous design of the Liberty head, flowing hair, the pole and the Phrygian cap are instilled in there. But the reverse is fun. There's baby America, United States, or we are in our infancy. We are trying to fend off from all different sorts of directions. This is the lion represents Britain, England, and there's two snakes there that are attacking too. And we have France represented as a defender of this new nation. So it's very interesting. Now, I want you to take note here. Sometimes little details send a little message. The mighty lion of Britain, if you notice, the tail curls between the legs and under. And if you go to the next slide, Ed. Now we see, these are actual drawings by Dupre. They were at an ANA show, the same one where I had, oh no, that was a year after that, I believe. And they were on display. It was called the Cardinal Collection that Martin Logies is the manager of. So he had these sitting there. It was fascinating, and we talked about that because Dupre's original sketch, one of them, was the lion, the British lion, and the tail's up, and a little bit of manhood showing there. And I thought, oh God, I don't want that on the medal, mainly because it's too indicative of power, and which is certainly us winning the war was far from that. So now, right here is very interesting, and it's hard for you to see. This is clear and pretty bold. He has some sort of a foot drawn here. Up here, there's another line, really faintly on this piece of paper. And what I did is, when you turn it around, what's going on, it's another line. He's pointing down. This is his head, his body and legs are this way, and he's sideways. Yes, and so it just shows you some of the in things we have today of the real work in designing the medal and Mr. Hall. And so here we, this is Martin and myself at the ANA. Of course, when the medal was made, I had to print a broadside. When I lived in Passy in France, I lived on an estate that was a very wealthy aristocracy French person that allowed me to stay in his estate, fully staffed, furnished, and everything. So of course I bought a printing press and had it delivered, and all the type and paper. And I printed while I was in Paris. So I thought, well, and this is in French. It's a nice broadside of the medal advertisement. There's the two images of the Libertas Americana. So this is an original broadside. There it is. It was in the ANA show. So I had to get a photo with Martin holding that. He pulled it out of the case, and he was hoping I wouldn't run off with it. So in a little bit of saving of time, I'm throwing out a few things that I had my hand in. This is the Fugio scent, obverse and reverse. This is the part that has the sundial and the all-seeing eye. You could see a little bit there. That's the eye in there. The constellation Lato coinage, the Nini, these porcelain pieces are interesting. When I was in France, it was very popular, and these were produced while I was there. There's lots of different varieties, and this one in particular, I actually own this one now again, and The fur cap is an interesting story, because when the Declaration was signed in that summer of '76 that everybody knows about, that hot summer, by October of '76, I was commissioned to go aboard ship, the Reprisal, colonial warship, secretly, and I took my my son with me to London, William, and I took him to France. It was my grandsons at that time. Yeah, we're negotiating, trying to get help, money, and funding for this war we just declared, or this separation, let's say. So the fur cap was a marten fur cap that I acquired on a trip to Canada during at the time of the French and Indian War, and beyond that, when there were attacks at the frontier of the colonists. So I was trying to get support for that. But going north to Canada, it was cold, and I loved that fur cap. It just kept this bald head nice and warm, and so I knew I'm taking the sea voyage across the ocean in October. We wouldn't arrive in France till November, so I certainly packed the fur cap with my belongings. When I debarked off the ship in France, I had it on my head, and the French were enamored with myself, my sort of plain brown suit, cloth buttons, and this fur cap. They viewed me as a frontiersman. Of course, I lived my entire life in Boston and Philadelphia, but I was not one to argue about certain things. I just let that go. That fur cap got me invited to a lot of social events in Paris, and through that, the ladies of Paris just adored that look, and of course that got me had nice introductions to some very influential people in France. So I thought, well, that's a good thing. We'll keep the fur cap on. So and then this is the Boston, not as Bostonia medal. That was a little past my time, but it's a beautiful medal. There's so many medals out there today with my image on them. I was so very popular. I wrote my daughter Sally when I was in France, my God, I'm more popular than the man in the moon. I was on everything, snuff boxes, and King Louis was so impressed with me that he actually had a wonderful porcelain piece made with my image on it, but it presented it, had to present it to me, and it arrived, and I unwrapped it, and it says, oh, it's very finely done, but it turned out it was a chamber pot with my image in the bottom. so I guess it took a little while to get in the king's favor, but it was a little rough start in the beginning, but it's a lovely chamber pot. So advance another. Okay, this looks familiar. I titled this in negotiating. All through my life, things were negotiated. This is an image of myself and George Washington, and he's at an older age. I first met him, though, during the French and Indian War when General Braddock was, even before George Washington was commissioned by Governor Dinwiddie of Governor of Maryland to come north and see the encroachments going on right here. Of course, Fort Duquesne, we all know the story here at the fork of the rivers, the fight for the fort. And so I was told by Dinwiddie and some others to meet Braddock, General Braddock, in Frederick, where he was assembling this expedition into the wilderness. And so I went under sort of a guise of I'll establish dispatch routes, sort of like postal routes, with his staff and how we were going to communicate. So I was there for 5 days, dined with Braddock each of those times. And one of the things I recall, as I mentioned to the good general, that in the frontier, it's rather, you have to watch yourself because the Indians will, they'll attack from hidden positions along the way, and they're very hard to see. And there's a lot of frightening tactics they use. And of course, General Braddock, sort of nonsense. There's not a single savage that's ever going to be any match for a British regular. So if he took my advice, he took it for maybe a half a second, and then so there's not a famous painting, but an interesting painting. There's Braddock, and there's myself sitting there having that conversation. And there's a copy of this painting right in this area in Braddock, Pennsylvania. There's a museum, I came to find out, the Braddock Regional History Center. And so that hangs in there. And I was there for an event, and who did I see but General Braddock? So I said, and there's the painting up there. I said, well, let's recreate that scene, and I got a nice photo out of it. So I was very pleased with that. So Braddock and I had a nice conversation. Things are fine now. We're all dead. We're over the hardship. So, and a little bit more negotiation. This is interesting. There I am playing chess. Some viewed me as a chess master, and that was in London. And this lady sent messages for me. I was living on Craven Street at the time. So I would get messages that Caroline wants to play chess with me. So but I don't know her. But I finally went one evening, and her brother was there, and it just happened to be Admiral Howe, and Caroline was Admiral Howe's sister. This was right before the war was inevitable at that point. This was the last-ditch effort for Admiral Howe and General Howe. They were brothers, and one's in charge of the Navy, one's the Army, that are coming to America to slaughter us all. So we made one last-ditch effort to see if we could hammer out some agreement clandestinely in Caroline's home. And of course it never amounted or failed. My demands at that point were not my demands, but the colony's demands were not acceptable under any terms that even the British or the Parliament or the King would even hear of it. So the war was not averted. But as we fast forward at the time of the Libertas Americana medal, we certainly signed a treaty with Britain after they lost the war. And this is a famous painting with myself and Adams, and we were here as the Livingston and the negotiating team with the British post-war. And we thought, well, this would be wonderful to have a portrait, so we sat for it. And the artist commenced in producing it. And of course, we needed the British delegation to sit. And we understand that they wouldn't sit with us, but they certainly would pose in the same space over here separately. Well, of course, they never showed up. So that painting remains to this day like that. So if you find them out there, you could re-invite them. Maybe we could get an artist to finish, but I haven't seen any reenactors of the team that signed the treaty then. All right, Mr. Hall. But I have to tell you, really, I'm at my best in my garden in Philadelphia under my mulberry tree, and so many negotiations happened there between the Constitutional Convention and different things within the Pennsylvania Assembly. Well, I would often meet in the cooler summer nights and try to negotiate little problems and things that we had within the colony. So there's a few images of those special places. That garden built in our home, Debbie and I. It was magnificent. I lived very few years in that home. That home was being built while I was in France. So, and Debbie unfortunately died in that, and I never got to actually live in the home with Debbie. My daughter Sally and her husband Richard Bache lived in the residence then. And when I arrived back in America, 1785, after the 1782, the treaty, I of course moved back into my house. It was the first time I was able to see it. I was very meticulous with even down to the details of the design on the hinges for the doors and my lightning rod on the roof. I actually had the wire come down and split the wire and created a little bell when if a lightning would strike, a little bit of the charge would knock a little metal ball against the bell, and I would know that the house got struck. Of course, Debbie made me remove that. She just did not want to know what was going on in that roof during a thunder gust. I was, of course, fascinated with it. Okay, so moving forward, we brings us a little bit today. When I talk to people, I say, especially our young children and our young numismatists. This was a photo in one of the ANAs, this group of boys. So I'm showing them something there. I always tell them I only had 2 formal years of education, but I was a voracious reader. I read everything I could get my hands on. All my money I even scrimped and saved for, I bought books. All my books that I borrowed, I read in 2 or 3 nights, returned not a corner bent or anything wrong. I had complete access to libraries that were magnificent. And this was a start from my father's meager library in maybe about 10 volumes on the shelf with mostly things of religious preachers and publications of their sermons. John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, I've read that, and all sorts of the classics. But I tell the young children I'm encouraged to read. There I am sitting in my own home now reading, and this is funny. I'm reading a gray sheet right there at one of the coin shows. I found that fascinating. I was always interested in pricing and numbers. And I thought I would comment on my suit. I like this blue suit, and the reason I like this blue suit is during the ratification, the delegates at the convention, there's General Washington, there's Mr. Hamilton whispering something in my ear and about this new nation that we have created in our government with the 3 branches and the separations. So I have my blue suit on there. I thought, well, I like that suit, so I had myself sitting at my little backdrop there, and I thought I felt a ghost behind me, but somebody was kind enough to Photoshop that and send it to me. So I thanked them for that, and just thought, oh, this is the best part of the presentation. So one of the things that's always so much as happens in the taverns at the time. This is an image of the Green Dragon in Boston, which a lot of the war and the rebels met there. There's France's Tavern. These taverns are still there. France's Tavern in New York, and the City Tavern, my favorite, in Philadelphia. So I loved music when I was in France. Madame Brillon and I, who was I was fascinated with, we come to find out we liked Scottish and Irish folk music that told stories, and so we would often trade and do a sing-song. Tavern life in those days would have you would offer something, a poem, a verse, a prose, a song, or if you played an instrument, like mine. Well, it certainly wouldn't be an harmonica at a tavern, but if you had a fiddle or a violin, you know, there would often be music played. But I think for today, I'm going to end our talk, and I'm going to invite you to, if you want to, come to the tavern. But and it's supposed to be 90 degrees outside today, very hot, I'm told, which I'm feeling a little bit here. But anyhow, I'm being polite. I'm off to the tavern, and I'll ask you to come along with me, offer a song, offer a story, offer a bit of poetry, or offer some advice. But I think what I'll give for you right now is a song that has a little bit of a coin in it. So, and I should mention that old colonial clothing, sometimes they use copper coins for the buttons. So there could be hidden somewhere in these buttons something quite significant, but most of the clothing never survived, but there are some pieces around. But anyhow, so Christmas time is coming, the geese are getting fat. Please to put a penny in the old man's hat. Haven't got a penny, halfpenny will do. Haven't got a halfpence, God bless you. Thank you. Follow me and we'll have a wonderful night.